I'm now delighted to introduce Natasha Rajic, Senior Director of Strategic Consulting at Cytel, our webinar presenter today. Natasha has been a practicing biostatistician for over 20 years. At Cytel, she helps clients explore and apply appropriate study designs and address difficult clinical development problems. Her experiences range from studies employing advanced methods to dose escalation to late-stage regulatory interactions on product development issues. Before Cytel, Natasha was a biostatistician at Pfizer in New York, where she provided statistical reviews of business opportunities and due diligence evaluations and oversaw statistical input on regulatory interactions related to submissions, label extensions and negotiations, and product safety inquiries. Our webinar today is preparing for regulatory interactions when planning adaptive designs with interim analysis. Interim analysis for clinical trials with adaptive study designs can involve intricate decision options, involved operational and procedural concerns, and advanced underlying statistical considerations. All of this needs to be adequately pre-planned and pre-specified in relevant study documents that are presented to the regulatory bodies for review of the study plan. During today's webinar, Natasha will walk us through the essential documents and preparations needed when preparing for regulatory interactions involving adaptive designs with interim analysis. I will now hand over to Natasha for her presentation.
Thank you, Michael. I briefly open my webcam so you can see me. Hello, everyone. Happy to have you here. Let me just close the webcam real quick. Special hello to my West Coast colleagues and audience members, because it's 7 a.m. here on the West Coast, so glad to have you as well. And of course, for our European colleagues and who are maybe late in the day. This topic today is of special interest to me recently because I was participating in a couple of studies that were preparing for the submission to the regulatory agencies. And I've noticed some confusion with the study team, within the study teams, of what necessary elements are needed there to prepare a robust package and to really avoid runaround and back and forth with the agencies and getting comments and going back and being asked for more documents. So, preparing regulatory interactions when planning adaptive designs with interim analysis. Of course, a lot of this is applicable to any non-adaptive designs that have interim analysis, and I'm sure you will notice the distinction. But it's here we specifically want to emphasize some of the features of the adaptive designs. Just quickly to go over why adaptive designs. Of course, we typically people think of doing adaptive designs to make use of knowledge efficiency and hopefully decrease development time. The stage advancement and optimization of available resources can result in decreased sample sizes and therefore decreased cost. With the calibration of initial design assumptions, one can improve precision and quality of information that they receive at the end. And all of this, of course, very importantly, can mitigate risks of your whole of the study and of the whole program, which of course cannot be underestimated. Adaptive study is the one that uses accumulating data to design on how to modify aspects of the study by pre-specified decision rules. So all of the guidances from various regulatory and other bodies do emphasize that pre-specification is necessary. And this should be done without undermining the validity and integrity of the trial. What that entails is, and this is what we're going to be concentrating here, primarily validity and integrity. Validity meaning the correct statistical inference is applied in terms of correct estimates and confidence intervals. Of course, for adaptive design, consistency between stages is very important. And then integrity, meaning maintaining confidentiality of the data and minimizing operational bias. In order to guide us into how to approach this, I came across this document that I think it's very helpful. And it is the a document that comes from FDA on a good review practice, or really a guideline for the reviewers of how to review study applications. And in there, you can see these two questions in highlighted in blue. It's really, in a way, underlying what I had on a previous slide, which is appropriate accounting for interim analysis and other types of multiplicity. So question on one of the questions on validity and one of the concerns of one of the statistical concerns. And then the second one is there adequate assurance that integrity of the trial caused by interim unblinding is not compromised? So that addresses that concern about the integrity of the trial. So you can see that even in the review guideline for the reviewers, it's specifically questions that they need to concentrate on when they review the applications, and direct link with validity and integrity that's typically highlighted in all the definitions of adaptive designs. So to dig a little bit deeper, what is, when we talk about validity concerns, what are we actually talking about here? And I alluded to that in 2 slides ago. Whether their estimates are valid, because, as you know, the adaptive designs typically involve different stages of the study, and combining them may not necessarily end up in a valid estimation, both point and interval estimates. Are the conclusion biased in any way? And very importantly, and this is emphasized in all of the regulatory guidances, is there appropriate control over type 1 error of the is the pre-specified type 1 error maintained? And to illustrate that, you can see actual comments that I picked up from some of the regulatory reviews and correspondence, which with the comments that you may have, examples you may see before. When we talk about integrity concerns, basically you have to convince prior to even to the start of the trial, of course, and throughout the trial and at the end have a auditable and traceable documentation of this, that the procedures for ensuring the confidentiality of the data and for preserving the integrity of the rest of the trial should be described in detail. And that's almost it's almost a little bit trickier than the previous one, because the previous one is addressing correct application of the statistical procedures and rules. It can get methodologically difficult, but in the end, with all the knowledge and methodological research that's been done around adaptive designs, and typically with simulations, one way or the other, that can be addressed in most cases. This one, it's a little bit more elusive, because it sounds simple, questions like who will be making the recommendations. Usually it's independent DMC, and you list you're familiar with charters, so you can imagine how that looks like, describing who the DMC members are, how often they're going to meet, what type of analysis are they going to look at, who will perform the analysis, typically independent statistical center. But when it comes to how will they communicate it with the sponsor, with the independent statistical center, possibly with a data management center, if there's a steering committee, the more parties involved, the more difficult it seems to become to actually describe all the communication that goes on within a trial and around the trial concerning interim analysis and DMC activities. So I will touch briefly on some of the documentation that may help you towards achieving that. I also highlight this particular quote from on one of the trials is to mitigate introduction of operational bias, please have operational procedures in place to ensure that the IDMC does not reveal unblinded interim results to study investigators per recommendation given in Meta and POCOC. So you can see that this was a comment from FDA regulatory agencies. It's not enough to just say have kind of broad statements how bias and integrity, how bias will be minimized, integrity will be chosen, but they want specific operational details. So this could be one possible way to address. So I will concentrate now a couple of slides on the integrity concerns first, and then we'll talk about statistical concerns and how to address them through examples, two of the examples. But first we'll concentrate on integrity concerns. And one document that FDA met, for example, and of course, you know, being in the US, most of my comments here are illustrated with communication and guidances from FDA. But if you read the documents from EMEA, they're very aligned with thinking of FDA, and I'm sure other agencies follow suit as well. So this would be a something called data matrix, and it can be part of your data access plan. And here, you may have seen something like this for a trial in general when, for example, a data monitoring plan or data integrity plan. But this would be something that's specifically for geared towards communication and access to data with respect to interim analysis and whether it's adaptive to trial, not that's right, but interim analysis. So in order to do this, you need to sit down with your team, and I'm assuming the audience here is primarily statisticians, but this needs to be done with the whole team, and first identify departments and roles that would have be involved in the study and be surrounding the study team. So not just direct people involved in the operation day-to-day of the study, but people who may have access to the interim results. And then for each of those roles, define whether they have access or not to the either to the treatment codes or specifically to the results of the interim results. So this is just an illustration. Of course, there would be many more roles so I've helped clients prepare tables like this, but I would give them just a general guidelines of what needs to be included there. The actual rows of what team members to or roles to include, it really depends on their specific situation. That's why I say in the titles it's a study and sponsor specific. This is another, I'm a big proponent of visual presentations. They cannot replace the text that you would include in these documents, but something like this would go a great way, and it would help reviewers interpret the text that you write about who sees what and when. So I strongly suggest you try to, of course, they don't have to be this involved in terms of graphics. It can be just a stick figure. But it helps show the regulators that you thought about this, that you thought about who are all the members involved in a trial and how they would communicate with respect to interim results. So just to recap on this part, DMC chart, of course, still remains your important document. and that's nothing new for interim analysis. Complicated, and I don't like the word, but perhaps involved interim analysis of adaptive designs. Sometimes it's just easier to construct the interim SAP, and especially this is important if you do have elements in the SAP that are need to be with the restricted access. So it's easier, instead of having appendices to the regular SAP, you may prepare interim SAP and keep it separate from the regular SAP. I do like to see interim analysis report skeleton, because that prepares the DMC charter, the DMC members of what it's going to actually see, so everybody's clear what is coming, instead of the interim results coming and then they ask for more information. Then even just the requests may be unblinding. So I'm a strong proponent of this having a skeleton, and detailed skeleton, of course. And then for the adaptive designs, there needs to be all of these additional documents. It's really just one document, whether you call it adaptation plan or technical appendix, where you clearly outline the rationale for the design, comparison to alternatives. Because remember, for adaptive design, the regulators still ask for why go with adaptive design? It can non-adaptive design answer your questions. So you do need to justify the choice of your design, of course, which may include comparison to the alternatives, evaluation of important operational characteristics, and that goes beyond just power and type 1 error. It can be study length. It can be timing of the interim analysis. And I mean, of course, all of these details help you in the planning as well. But in terms of representing to the regulatory agencies, they may want to see if you evaluated all other options and actually really ended up with the most optimal operational characteristics. And then a simulation report which supports all of these elements. Data access plan is what I mentioned earlier as well, which would have description of who sees what and when, hopefully supported with the data access matrix and the graphics, as I said. Okay, so to wrap up this part of the, which was mostly emphasizing the data integrity elements of the two concerns that we highlighted. And after this, we will go to the two examples and highlight some of the statistical or validity concerns that need to be presented. But just to wrap up this first part, it goes without saying you need to plan in advance. Unfortunately, I see a lot of times, as I'm sure you're familiar, there's such a rush to go to and present to regulatory agencies the plans for the new study, that a lot of times things are left for later, which if you don't have these things planned in advance, you're just delaying your development program, you are increasing cost. So there is no reason not to give a little bit of more time to pre-plan and prepare the documents instead of rushing and having to go back and do repeated rounds and answers, and really weaken your credibility with the regulators. So you want to have, of course, prospectively planned adaptations as for any adaptive design. Think about these additional documentation that's needed. Be prepared on increased correspondence. Have the data access plan with clearly documented role-based access with any auditable traceability. That's also important. Just saying who will see what and when before the trial is not enough. After the trial is over, you do need to have documentation of who saw what when, and that's not possible with just an email system or a SharePoint. You need a well-devised system to do that. You want to educate your entire teams. This is a group project. This is not something that one group can take on their own. And then in these documents, you want to describe in detail, of course, what are the decision rules, the adaptation rules, what adequate statistical methods will be taken to get proper inference. You want to give assurance of a type 1 error control. Again, communication plan for various parties involved in the interim analysis, and how the maintenance of firewalls will be maintained and how it will be documented for the end of the trial. Okay, so now we're going to go into two examples. First one I just find very, very interesting. I did not work on it directly. It's from my Cytel colleagues. The second one I actually did work with the client on it, and it's actually in progress. So the first one is involves stopping rules and sample size estimation in a time to event study. It happens that both of these examples actually have two interim analyses, which it's of course not as common as having only one interim analysis. So these examples are kind of on the outer edge of complexity. This first one is a phase 2/3 oncology trial. The sponsor came to us with the problem of studying in rare disease, so accrual is definitely an issue. They did have a prior data from small phase 2 trial, but did not feel that they have enough information to reliably size the phase 3 study. So if you remember the first slides where I talk about why we do adaptive design trials, this is trying to calibrate your initial assumptions and definitely mitigate your risks. So not jumping into a phase 3 study without proper knowledge and appropriately summarizing the knowledge that you already have. So the question was how to design a pivotal trial that makes productive use of existing data. And the design that we collectively, Cytel colleagues and this client came together in a time to event study was to have first interim analysis to evaluate a futility analysis based on a progression-free survival endpoint, and use a go no go decision rule based on using prior trial data. And then the second, if that goes through, the second interim analysis would be for sample size re-estimation and possible early stopping for efficacy or futility. And that interim analysis was based on the overall survival. And then the final analysis would be, of course, on the overall survival endpoint. For something like this, adaptation plan, and the other example that I have also has similar structure. It would have a study design overview, nothing too elaborate, but enough so that the reader can be reminded of what the study is about, what are the treatments, how long was it planned for, or how many interim analyses planned. And then it would go into these sections which actually describe the procedures that will be done at each interim analysis. Of course, there are two interim analyses here, so two separate sections. The first one describes the go, no go decision making. The endpoint to consider here is progression-free survival, not the overall survival. Because it's based on a Bayesian decision-making, prior distribution parameters will have to be described, and then the calculation of the posterior predictive distribution and the decision rules, something like this. At the second second interim analysis, sample size re-estimation with futility and efficacy was planned based on conditional power. And for something like that, and again, the decision rule based on the conditional power for sample size estimation. For the final procedure, for the final analysis, a combination test statistic was used to combine information for various stages. And one thing that I want to emphasize here is a lot of times I see clients put in, I mean, there is a lot of methodological work behind this. For example, how to calculate conditional power for a time to event study, how to combine the phases appropriately into using combination test statistic. But just referencing particular paper or manuscript where that is described is not enough, because what you really need to do is translate that methodological paper or the approach into your specific study features. So you don't need to repeat the technical details of derivation of why this controls type 1 error, but you do need to show that your study matches the assumptions in a particular manuscript, and therefore if you can just by similarity with that, you can claim for example, a type 1 error control, or if not, then you need to do simulations. You need to show by simulations anyway. But in terms of these applying the definitions of how to calculate, for example, conditional power, or how to calculate the combination test statistic, just referencing the papers is not enough. You have to translate it to your particular trial and say, if stratified log rank test statistics is used, how are you going to combine it from one stage to another? Which strata are you going to use? For example, in this case, when the simulation was performed, details of the joint simulation of progression-free survival and overall survival. Again, there is a methodology out there how to do it, but this particular adaptation plan specified what the prior distributional parameters for the priors were, how the correlation specifically, how it was calculated, how would the parameters calculated, these lambdas. So that's what I wanted to emphasize here, that it's basically a translation of methodology into an application to your specific needs. So the second example, it's just a little bit of a different flavor, but you'll see when we come to the adaptation plan, similar structure and concerns. This one was originally planned as a two-stage trial with one interim analysis for dose selection. That was the only interim analysis that was originally planned. And then throughout the study, as the study was ongoing, the sponsor decided to add 2 additional interim analyses. So when I say pre-planned adaptations, it really means pre-planned before you actually conduct it. So it's not pre-planned. Once the study starts, you cannot add any adaptations. You can. I mean, of course, they're controversial and a bit, and will be scrutinized, but by reviewers and by anybody, by the public. But of course, it is possible to do them. So in this particular case, after that first dose selection that was planned, additional 2 interim analyses were added. One was just a blinded for overall response rate. This is a binary endpoint in this case, and then the third one was added for a sample size re-estimation, also unplanned. So following the first interim analysis, client went to the regulatory agency and to get agreement that the second and third interim analysis can be added. And they did not oppose. They agreed with all the other rationale of why this is needed, but they emphasize greatly that the protocol or SAP should clearly outline a method to control the overall type 1 error rate, because of course this would be of great concern here. So in that adaptation plan, again, starting with the study design overview, the procedure for the first interim analysis, dose selections, that was already available from the protocol and the SAP, and that actually already happened when I was introduced to this protocol. And of course, the client came to us after they received these comments, because that's when I first saw the protocol. And then the second interim analysis was just a pooled review response rate, and it was not a concern of inflation of type 1 error. But then the third interim analysis included a sample size re-estimation based on conditional power. So, of course, details on how that's done, what are the rules for whether to increase the sample size or not, what is the futility boundary, what method was used to estimate the futility boundary. When sometimes you can use conditional power as approach to specify the boundary for the futility as well, but in this particular case, a spending function was used. So all of that has to be specified in the adaptation plan, and then of course the decision rules, which I already said. And I put the nice graphic for the decision rules here because they were not so straightforward. The final analysis was particularly involved because, I mean, the technical detail behind it, because it included multiplicity adjustment for both the dose finding and for the combination of 3 stages. So I'm flashing at you just one line of that document, but careful consideration had to be given to how to calculate the weights for each of these individual stages, and then also how to calculate stage-wise adjusted p-values. So PQ and R are p-values for each stage, which of course include multiplicity adjustment for multiple doses, and then overall to adjust for having the 3 stages all together. So there was again, the theory there exists, but to apply it specifically to this trial and to these considerations, you know, took some time, not too long, but took some time. Simulations for showing the control of type 1 error was, of course, very important here. And to just give you a note on simulations, sometimes I get a comment from clients, oh, why do we need simulations? Is it just nice to have? They're not just nice to have, they're important because a lot of these, for a lot of methods, you do have a methodological findings of showing that, for example, a type 1 error is preserved, but for a lot of them, that's not readily available, and simulations are really the only way to assess the actual type 1 error in a trial. Overall type 1 error is controlled in a trial. But beyond that, you use simulations to evaluate your study design options, of course, for sample size, duration, timing of interim analysis. So you use them for your pre-planning. But you also use them, as I said earlier, not just for your internal decision making, but you may want to need to, you would want to, you would want to show them to the regulatory agencies when you try to justify why a particular adaptive design was chosen over a non-adaptive design. And that's where simulations of the operational characteristics, for example, will help. It's always good to estimate probability of success, of course. And a note about simulations under the null scenarios. This is something that if you read the new guidance on adaptive designs that came out of the updated one from September 2018, you will see that, and the one that came from FDA, there is a considerable wording there regarding how to, well, it doesn't tell you how, but it tells you that you have to think about various scenarios under null hypothesis in order to simulate the trials and estimate the probability of type 1 error. Not as straightforward as we may think. Here, I just wanted to illustrate again that graphics really goes a long way. The one on the right is for enrichment trial and actually from a published paper. The one on the left is from another adaptation plan and describes decision trees for switching from non-inferiority to superiority trial based on the interim analysis. So I want to leave you with, again, going back to that reviewer guideline that I mentioned, that is an FDA document. Although many of these designs raise complex analytical issues related to multiplicity, control of type 1 error, and potential unblinding, several adaptive features are well established and should be considered in many trials, and in some cases suggested if not proposed by sponsor. So we shouldn't stay away. We shouldn't kind of shrink from the adaptive designs, thinking that regulators don't like them. That's definitely not true. And to illustrate that further, I'm sure many of you are aware that FDA launched a pilot program in support of complex trial designs for drugs and biologics. And when they talk about complex trial designs, it's beyond what I think of beyond adaptive, but talking about basket trials, umbrella trials, master protocols, and so forth. So the regulators are there; they're ready. They know the statistical reviewers. They're savvy, of course. They know the literature and methodology, and they're, as we see by this comment from the reviewer guidelines, they're even there to help you and suggest things you can do. So in summary, maintaining validity and integrity is of course important. And to show that, you want to address all the important statistical issues related to type 1 error, control, proper estimation, and bias in your adaptation plan or in your technical document. If you have a somewhat complex adaptive design, you may want to prepare a separate SAP, but you do need an adaptation plan at a minimum. You want to sit down with your whole team and identify role and access for all parties involved. These are just some, I'm sure there are others. So with those definition roles, present data integrity or data access plan for the interim analysis. I strongly suggest adding visuals to all of your text descriptions, not all of them, but where appropriate. And I want to leave you with considering what a possible consequence, and I alluded to this in the beginning, of not having these documents ready. You're just adding delays, loss of credibility with the agencies, and really risk to the whole program. The final thought, adaptive designs can provide a great opportunity to redesign trial based on accumulating data. It may be more efficient in some cases. It may take less time, definitely mitigate risks, allow you to calibrate your initial assumptions. But each trial is different, and there are no one-size-fits-all solution. And in some cases, and and others, adaptive designs may not be the best solution at all. And that's why regulatory agencies want you to justify their use. The decision whether to use adaptive design or not is something that is collectively determined by all parties involved. So from all of this, so implementation may sound or feel like a challenge at times, but there are many successful examples out there in all stages of development, starting from, of course, phase 1 and all the way to adaptive phase 3 and confirmatory trials. There are many others who contributed in some way or another from Cytel. These are some of the colleagues that I want to highlight that their work was included in these slides: Sam, Ling Yun, Yiting, Adam, Jim. I included research references that are directly mentioned in this presentation, but in one way or the other. But of course, there are many more. And if you want to get more information on all the available literature, I can certainly help you with that. And you can contact me at my email address. It was very nice talking to you all, and I'm looking forward to getting your questions and comments now. So Michael, I turn back to you.
Thank you, Natasha. We're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit your questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. And the first question coming in is, who should be involved in preparing for regulatory interactions when planning adaptive designs?
Yeah, so I mentioned a couple of times, I didn't go in detail, but that all involved parties in the clinical trial or in the planning of the study should be involved. And there's a reason with that, because even though some of these elements, for example, adaptation plan looks very statistics heavy, and you may think, or other people may think, that they don't have, for example, the appropriate knowledge to understand all the details. But as statisticians, we should explain important elements and connect it to the overall study design. And what I mean by that, yes, there is some conditional power, combination test statistic, very statistical terms, but when it comes to talking to other members of the team, they need to understand that, for example, that there's 3 stages involved in the final analysis. Then we may need to show that 3 stages are comparable, homogeneous, that how they're going to be, that they can actually be combined. We need to, for example, alert our regulatory colleagues that that's one of the questions that we may be asked at the end. What is the validity of combining the 3 stages? When it comes to type 1 error, everybody on the team in a company needs to know whether we have control of type 1 error, for example, for secondary endpoints. You don't want everybody to assume if we have significant statistical findings on secondary endpoints, for example, that they can be automatically included in the label. And not to mention also the whole issue about estimates and making sure that you define your estimate at the beginning together with your clinical colleagues, so that at the end, the analysis of the trial is reflecting the planned estimate of interest. So the short answer is one way or the other, everybody included in the trial should be aware of what having an interim analysis entails, both in scientific terms and especially on operational terms. So operations colleagues are essential here, and they are critical, and it's important for them to understand what does it mean to have to maintaining the blind, not just the blind, but maintaining the integrity. A lot of times I hear, for example, there's these sample size re-estimation for open label studies. So meaning that the treatment itself is not blinded to the patients, to the investigators, but that doesn't mean that we can have results of the interim analysis known to all. And sometimes people confuse those things. A lot of times I hear, oh, this study is not blinded, therefore nothing else needs to be blinded. That's definitely not true. And I like how the latest guidance from the FDA doesn't even use the words blind and unblinded anymore. For example, for interim analysis, whether it's blinded and unblinded, it calls it using comparative and non-comparative data, which may sound like a subtle distinction, but it's really important.
Thank you. Another question that came in is, any thoughts on the process of blinding in open studies?
Yes. So I'm assuming open label studies, which is what I just touched on. So, for example, let's say the study is open label. Am I using the term? It's not open label. It's not blinded. Let's, the treatment assignment is known to subjects and investigators and everybody else in the trial, but you still, and this is actually true in even if you don't have interim analysis adaptive design, you do not, if the trial, whoever is involved in the operations of the trial, if they don't need to see for example, aggregated summaries by treatment, they should not be able to see it throughout the trial, because anything that can reveal the treatment effect to the people actually doing the trial is possibility for introduction of bias. And all efforts should be made to minimize that. So to go back to the question of in open label studies, you still want to have adaptation plan. For example, if you're doing interim analysis for sample size re-estimation, any adaptation rules that are going to follow interim analysis should be kept separate and not accessible during the trial to the trial members, only to DMC and to possibly independent statistical center. There is no reason for trial executioners to have that information and to know it. It's kind of like need to know basis, and it's really all towards not changing, not influencing people who are at the sites, who are administering the trial, study managers, data managers, and unduly influencing in any way. And this is important. The FDA guidance doesn't talk too much about this, but if you look at the EMEA guidance, there's a lot of mention of this, and the fact that you want to convince at the end of the trial, you want to pre-plan and also convince the audience at the end of the trial that the 2 or 3 or multiple stages of your adaptive design, adaptive study, are comparable and can be combined. That's something that's very much emphasized in the EMEA guidance. You have to pre-plan how you're going to evaluate whether stages can be combined, whether they're homogeneous, and all this is all with respect to whether the introduction of the adaptation in the middle of a trial somehow influence the trial executioners and therefore bias was introduced. So with that respect, you have to we want to try to have separate teams or clearly defined roles. Sometimes it's hard in smaller companies to have completely firewalled and separate teams of statisticians, programmers, data managers. But if that's not possible, have clear roles of who will receive information from the interim analysis from the DMC, and who would apply the adaptation for the rest of the trial.
Thank you. Another question is, does the agency insist on strong control of type 1 error for secondary endpoints?
Secondary endpoints. Yes, that's an interesting question. Historically, the answer would be yes, definitely. But there are considerations for rare disease or Bayesian methods, especially in pediatric studies. With Bayesian methods, it may not be as straightforward to analytically show the control of type 1 error. So that's where simulations, of course, help. But in terms of secondary endpoints, the answer is yes, strong control of type 1 error for secondary as well. If you, of course, you want to include them in some label claims. But there are exceptions to that too, and so that's why there's no one size fits all when you go to when you present your plans for the primary secondary analysis. You do want to and you plan to have label claims based on secondary endpoints. You do want to ask clearly the regulatory agencies, would this control that we do have in a trial, would this be satisfactory for including, for example, this in a possible label claims? So you have to take it case by case. The overall answer, yes, they would insist, but exceptions are out there and possible and study specific.
Thank you. Next question, what is the difference between DMC and adaptive design chart? Will the committee in these two charts be the same?
DMC and an adaptive, okay. So DMC is, you can have them for adaptive, non-adaptive study design studies. They monitor the integrity, the safety of the trial, of the participants, and they may or may not be involved in the adaptation of the study. They definitely oversee the safety and have regular safety reviews. So typically, or most of the time, I've seen more often than not that the same DMC, if there is an adaptive feature of the trial, the same DMC would do the safety reviews and the interim reviews with the adaptation. Of course, you have to choose carefully your DMC members. If there's a dose selection, you as a sponsor are putting a great deal of trust into the DMC members. If there is a complex adaptation rule, of course, the statistical member is very important. But there are sometimes instances where the two are kept separate. So you have a DMC for overall safety and monitoring of the trial, and then you may have a separate interim or adaptive DMC that is concentrated only on study adaptation. The membership in the second one would be specifically for people who have experience in versed in adaptive design. And if you definitely need a statistician in the the adaptation DMC, or however we call it, who has experience with complex adaptation rules. So the short answer is, yeah, sometimes, a lot of times it's the same group of people, but if your trial is specifically has a complex adaptation rules where certain set of knowledge is needed, then you would need a separate DMC. And that separate, it wouldn't be just statisticians. You do need clinicians and other specialists who are KOLs who are versed in adaptive design rules. So it's kind of like a more specialized DMC, the adaptation DMC, and not. I would say studies. It's more often than not that it's the same group of people for both. But as I said, sometimes you do require a specialist.
Thank you. In regards to the time, we won't be able to get all these questions answered now in the live session, but we will get back to these offline afterwards. Before we end the session, anything you want to add, Natasha?
Actually, I do. I was joking with my internally with my Cytel colleagues. Two years ago, if you asked me about presenting a topic on this, I would think, oh, there's nothing to talk about. These are simple things. What is it to? We don't need to devote a whole webinar on preparation of documents. That's silly. But after seeing numerous examples with clients, as I said, going to FDA and being sent back for with comments to prepare more justification, more explanation, in-depth evaluation of their adaptive designs in the pre-planning stage, I realized that in order to help clients to get better prepared and also to kind of organize my thinking about it, I thought this topic does deserve some attention. So hopefully you found it useful and are a little bit better prepared going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to view a recording of today's webinar, as well as the accompanying slides. On behalf of Natasha and the Cytel team, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.